He threw her out at 11 o'clock at night. No money, no warning, no mercy. Brian Thorne was a billionaire. He had everything, a empire, a penthouse, a stunning young girlfriend on his arm. He thought he had won. Then one evening, in the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, he looked up from his wine glass and saw her, his ex-wife, 7 months pregnant, wearing emerald silk, glowing like he had never seen her glow in 7 years of marriage. And she was holding the hand of the one man in business Brian Thorne truly feared. The wineglass shattered in his grip. But that was just the beginning, because what Brian didn't know yet, what would destroy him completely, was that the woman he had thrown out into the rain had been quietly building a weapon she had hidden inside the very code that made him a billionaire. And tonight, she was going to use it. This story will teach you one brutal truth. The people you crush on your way to the top are the ones who will be standing there when you fall. If that hit something inside you, stay with us. Drop a comment telling me, what was the moment you knew Brian had already lost everything? Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell because next time, the story gets even colder.
The chandeliers at the Lorraine restaurant were not just crystal. Brian Thorne liked to tell people they were made of pure diamond. It matched the image he had carefully created for himself. He was the man who could turn nothing into a fortune, the tech wizard who went from the rough Chicago streets to the penthouses of Manhattan. Tonight, Brian sat at the best table in the restaurant, a spot usually reserved for royalty. Across from him was Chloe, a 23-year-old model. Her beauty was dazzling, but her conversation was not. She was scrolling through her social media, her thumb pausing on her own photos. "Put your phone away, Chloe." Brian's voice was quiet, but had a sharp bite. "We're celebrating. The merger with Concade Logistics is done. I am now the main shareholder." Chloe looked up, her blue eyes pretty but vacant. "Oh, right. Good for you, honey. Does this mean we can finally get that house in the mountains? The one with the private dock?" Brian swirled the expensive wine in his glass, feeling a deep sense of emptiness. "We can buy the whole mountain if you want," he said, but the words felt hollow. It had been 6 months. That was how long it had been since his divorce from Emma. Just saying her name felt like a bad taste in his mouth. She had been his college girlfriend, the woman who used to patch up his socks when he was too broke to afford a new pair. She was the one who would stay up all night checking his first business plans. But as Brian's bank account got bigger, Emma stayed the same. She liked quiet nights at home and comfortable shoes instead of fancy ones. She did not know how to impress rich investors or take charge in a meeting. Brian had convinced himself that he had just moved beyond her. He needed a trophy on his arm, not a real partner. So he ended it with cold precision. He remembered the day perfectly. He gave her the divorce papers and a check, telling her she did not fit into his life anymore. She did not scream or cry. She just looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, crushing sadness, and whispered, "You'll pay for this, Brian," before she walked out into the heavy rain. "Brian, you are not even listening to me," Chloe complained, tapping her fork on her water glass. "I ordered the lobster, but our waiter is totally ignoring us." "He's not ignoring you. He is just busy," Brian snapped back, his patience gone. Suddenly, all the background sounds of the restaurant, the soft jazz, the quiet conversations, the clinking of forks and knives, stopped. It was not a gradual silence. It was as if everyone held their breath at the same time. Brian looked around, confused. Lorraine had celebrities all the time. A hush like this meant someone truly important had just arrived. "Who is that?" Chloe asked, craning her neck to get a better look. "Is that a movie star or something?" Brian turned slightly in his seat to see the entrance. The host, a man named Pierre who usually acted like he was better than everyone, was now practically bowing. 2 people came in, flanked by 4 security guards who moved like well-trained professionals. The man was tall, easily over 6 feet 2 inches, and wore a handmade charcoal suit that probably cost more than Brian's first car. He had salt and pepper hair and a strong jawline that looked like it was cut from stone. Brian froze. He knew that man. Everyone in high-stakes finance knew him. That was Adrian Vance, the CEO of Vance Global. He was the man who owned the shipping lines Brian used, the communication satellites Brian rented, and the banks Brian borrowed from. Adrian Vance came from old, established power. He was an apex predator, so powerful that other powerful people stayed out of his path. But it was not Adrian who made the blood drain from Brian's face. It was the woman holding his arm. She wore a long, flowing emerald green silk gown that fit her perfectly before spreading out around her feet. Her hair, which she used to wear in a simple bun, now fell in perfect, shiny waves down her back. A sapphire necklace rested on her collarbone, catching the light and sparkling like a bright, blue star. It was Emma. But it was not the Emma he knew. The quiet, shy woman was gone. This woman stood tall, her eyes scanning the room with a calm confidence that was almost intimidating. And then Brian saw it. The silk dress was perfectly tailored to show the very clear, round curve of her belly. She was very pregnant. Brian's grip on his wine glass tightened so hard that the stem broke in his hand. Red wine spilled onto the perfectly white tablecloth, looking shockingly like a pool of blood. "Oh my gosh, Brian, look what you did," Chloe exclaimed, jumping back so the wine would not get on her dress. Brian did not even hear her. All he could hear was a loud ringing in his own ears. Pregnant. She looked like she was at least 7 months along. He quickly did the math in his head. It had been 6 months since the divorce. She was 7 months pregnant. The room began to feel like it was tilting. Was the baby his? Or had she really found someone else that quickly? As the host led Adrian and Emma through the restaurant, their path brought them directly past Brian's table. Brian felt paralyzed, unable to look away. He expected Emma to look down or try to avoid his gaze. But instead, as they got closer, Emma's eyes locked directly onto his. There was no fear in her look. There was no love either. There was only a cold, detached indifference, the kind of look you would give a complete stranger. Adrian Vance gently put a hand on Emma's lower back and leaned in to whisper something to her. Emma laughed, a light, happy sound that Brian had not heard from her in years. They moved past his table, leaving a subtle scent of jasmine and expensive perfume in the air. "Wait a second," Chloe whispered, her eyes narrowed. "Is that not your ex-wife? The one who was a little bit plain?" Brian just stared at the red stain spreading on the tablecloth. "Yes," he finally said, his voice sounding distant and strange. "That is Emma." A waiter rushed to their table to clean the spill, apologizing again and again as if Brian's mistake was his fault. Brian waved him away, completely losing his appetite. "I don't get it," Chloe said, tearing off a piece of bread. "You told me she was broke. You said she was nobody. So, how is she with him? That's Adrian Vance. My father says he has enough money to buy this whole city." "I do not know, Chloe," Brian said, his voice so loud that a couple at the next table turned to look. He lowered his voice, clenching his hands into tight fists under the table. "I do not know." Across the room, Adrian and Emma were shown to the most exclusive private table, the one even Brian had never been able to book. It had a perfect view of the entire city skyline. The table offered just enough privacy to be intimate. Brian watched them, his focus intense. He watched Adrian pull out Emma's chair for her. He saw the way the restaurant staff hurried to their table, treating Emma like a queen. But what bothered him the most was the way Adrian looked at her. It was not the look a man gives a pretty accessory. It was a look of pure, genuine love, especially when his hand rested on her pregnant belly after he sat down. That one move looked possessive, protective, and fatherly all at the same time. Is it his kid? Brian's thoughts were spinning. That is not possible. We were still a couple 7 months ago. It has to be mine. But she never told me anything. A sudden feeling of ownership washed over him. If that was his child, he had a right to know. He was Brian Thorne. People did not keep things from him. I am going to the men's room. Don't be long, Brian said, standing abruptly. Chloe whined, but I want dessert. Brian ignored her and crossed the restaurant, heading not for the restrooms, but for their private booth. His heart hammered with anger and a desperation that caught him off guard. Two huge men in suits suddenly blocked his path. Move, Brian ordered, using the voice that commanded boardrooms. I know them. Mr. Vance is not seeing anyone, one guard stated flatly. A deep voice from inside said, Let him pass, Marcus. The men parted. As Brian entered the booth, Emma never looked up from her menu. She was absolutely glowing, her skin radiant and her cheeks flushed. She looked more beautiful and alive than he had ever seen her. Emma, Brian said, his voice tight. She lowered the menu, her hazel eyes cool and distant. Hello, Brian. I was wondering when you would storm over here. You are pregnant, he stated plainly. As sharp as ever, she replied dryly. He glanced at Adrian, who smirked at him over a glass of scotch. Brian's eyes went back to her stomach. Is it mine? Emma let out a short, bitter laugh. Yours? You lost the right to ask that when you threw me out at 11 o'clock at night, saying I lacked vision. If that is my child, I have rights, Brian hissed, stepping closer. My lawyers will... Sit down, son, Adrian Vance said. His voice was quiet, but its sheer authority stopped Brian cold. Mr. Thorne, Adrian continued, swirling his drink, you seem to have some wrong ideas. Let me clear them up. First, do not raise your voice to my fiancé. It is bad for the baby. Fiancé. The word hit Brian like a fist. Second, Adrian said, his gaze hardening, you were too busy with your Instagram model to notice your wife that last year. You hardly touched her. We both know the truth, so do not act like a devoted husband now. Brian's face burned red. He searched Emma's face for any sign of weakness. Emma, tell him. Tell him what we had. I already told him who you are, Brian, Emma said softly, her hand on her belly. I told him you had to make me feel small so you could feel big. I told him how you called me worthless. She took Adrian's hand. Then Adrian showed me I was priceless. It is the money, is not it? Brian snapped, his pride breaking. That is it. You left a millionaire for a billionaire. You are just a gold digger, Emma. The air in the booth went cold. Adrian set his glass down, the soft click echoing like a shot. Be very careful, he said quietly. You are speaking to the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation. She is not like you. She earned her life back from the ruins you made. Just then, an impatient Chloe clicked over in her heels, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Honey, what is going on? She whined, grabbing Brian's arm. Her eyes found Emma, and she smirked. Oh, it is you. Wow. You have really gone downhill. The divorce must have been rough. A dead silence followed, but Emma just gave a slow, pitying smile. And you must be Chloe. Brian always liked shiny things with no substance. Chloe gasped. Excuse me? He is all yours, Emma said, returning to her menu. He is my discarded trash. But a word of advice. Read that prenuptial agreement closely. Brian guards his money very carefully. Adrian chuckled darkly. Marcus, get them out of here. They're ruining our meal. A guard stepped in front of them. This is not over, Emma, Brian snarled as he was led away. You will not keep my child from me. I will see you in court. I will destroy you. Adrian Vance stood up, towering over Brian. He leaned in, his voice a low growl. If you even look at her again, I will not sue you. I will buy your company just to sell it for parts, leaving you with nothing but that cheap suit. Never test me. Brian had to back down. He went to his table. Chloe's complaints a meaningless buzz in his ear. He just sat, staring at the empty chair that held his broken future, watching Emma laugh with a billionaire, pregnant with a double heir. For the first time, Brian Thorne felt completely powerless. But the night was not finished. As Brian signaled for the check, a man in a gray suit approached Adrian's table, a process server. Brian waited, hoping Adrian was in trouble. But the man passed Adrian and stopped at Brian's table. "Are you Brian Thorne?" the man asked. "Yes." "You have been served," he said, dropping a thick envelope by a wine stain. Brian tore it open. The suit was not from Adrian. It was from Emma. Plaintiff, Emma Vance Cross. The charge? Intellectual property theft of the Thorne algorithmic model. The blood left Brian's face. The algorithm. The code that made him a billionaire. He always claimed he wrote it, but Emma had, 10 years ago, in their dorm room. She was not here for revenge. She was here for everything. Morning light filled Brian's office, but brought no warmth. The room was freezing cold, just like the mood at the mahogany table. Brian held his head in his hands. Across from him, his lawyer, Marcus Sterling, a man paid $500 an hour to look bored, was panicking. "Tell me this is a joke, Sterling," Brian said, sliding the papers over. She was an English major. She proofread my emails. She did not write that code. Sterling removed his glasses, his forehead slick with sweat. "Brian, our tech team went through the source code for your algorithm, the one your company is based on. They found hidden metadata deep in the kernel. And," Brian snapped. Sterling hit a key, and code filled the wall screen. Tucked inside the complex lines was a programmer's note. "For Brian, so you can finally get some sleep tonight. Love, E." Brian stared. The memory hit him like a physical blow. It was 7 years ago. He was failing his finals because his program would not work. He had passed out on their cheap couch. When he woke up, the code was perfect. Emma was there with coffee and a tired smile, saying she had tinkered with it. He assumed she fixed a typo, not that she had rebuilt the whole thing from scratch. "It is worse," Sterling said quietly. "She copyrighted this exact code under the name Ghostwriter 3 days before your company even launched. She is the legal owner, Brian, and she wants an injunction to shut down your servers." "Shut us down?" Brian yelled, his chair crashing backward. "If our servers go down for an hour, our stock will drop 10%. If it is permanent, Thorntech will be bankrupt in less than a week." "Then you have to make a deal," Sterling said grimly. "Offer her anything. Money, stock, a public apology. If you fight, she has proof, and Adrian Vance's lawyers. They will crush us." Brian went to the window, looking over the city he thought he owned. His phone buzzed. A text from Chloe. "Babe, my card was declined at Gucci. Fix this now. People are staring." Brian threw the phone against the wall, where it exploded. He could not lose his company. He was Brian Thorne, a visionary, not a fraud who built an empire on his wife's genius. "Where is she at this moment?" Brian asked, turning towards Sterling. "She is hosting the Silver Gala at the Metropolitan Museum tonight," Sterling replied. "It is a charity fundraiser for single mothers. A ticket for one person is $20,000. "Get me a ticket," Brian insisted. "Brian, if you go anywhere near her, you are violating the restraining order." "I said, get me a ticket," Brian shouted. "I will not make a scene. I will simply remind her that she once loved me. Emma is a kind person. She is emotional. If I can just talk to her in private, without Vance nearby, I can get her to stop this. I can make her drop the lawsuit, Sterling seemed doubtful, but pulled out his phone. I will see what I can manage. But Brian, she no longer seems very kind. The Metropolitan Museum was transformed into a brilliant display of silver and white. The city's most influential figures, from politicians to wealthy socialites and tech moguls, glided through the great halls holding champagne glasses. Brian arrived alone. He had left Chloe at home, wanting to look serious and repentant. He wore his finest suit, but he felt like an imposter in his own life. It felt as if every hushed discussion he walked past was about him. Did you hear Thorntech stock plummeted today? I heard Vance Global is pouring money into one of their biggest competitors. Brian scanned the crowded room, looking for a gown the color of emeralds. But he saw no green that evening, only silver. Emma stood on a stage near the Temple of Dinder, speaking to the attendees with a microphone. She wore a silver maternity gown that draped around her like liquid moonlight. She appeared regal and utterly untouchable, like a queen addressing her subjects. And that is why the Vance Foundation is giving $50 million to fund legal support for women who faced injustice in their divorces, Emma declared, her voice firm and clear. The room erupted in applause. A feeling of nausea washed over Brian. That charity initiative was a direct assault on him. As Emma descended from the stage, instantly swarmed by supporters, Brian saw his moment. He navigated through the clusters of people, ignoring the icy glares from those he had wronged before. Emma, he called out. Just as her security detail started to escort her away, she stopped. The people around them backed away, forming a circle, as if sensing a dramatic event was about to unfold. It was the public showdown everyone had been anticipating. Emma turned around with deliberate slowness. For a change, Adrian was not by her side. He was across the room, speaking with a senator. This was Brian's chance. Brian, she said, her expression unreadable, you really purchased a ticket. How considerate. I will just apply that $20,000 as an initial payment on the alimony you have yet to pay me. The mention of alimony drew laughter from a few people standing close. Brian stepped nearer, his voice sinking to a desperate whisper. Emma, please, I have to talk with you in private. I have nothing to say to you that I cannot say in court, she responded coldly. This is about the business, Brian pleaded. You are going to destroy it. Do you know how many people will lose their jobs? I get that you are angry with me, but do not make my employees suffer for it. That is not who you are. You are a decent person. You are the type of woman who takes in stray cats. Emma's eyes flashed with fury. The woman who took in stray cats stopped existing the night she had to sleep in her car after her husband froze all her bank accounts. A collective gasp echoed through the onlookers. The blood drained from Brian's face. That was a secret he had hoped would never come out. I did not know you had nowhere to go, he stammered. I thought you were staying with your parents. My parents are gone, Brian. You were very aware of that. It just was not important to you. She moved right up to him, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. As for the business you claim is yours, it is not. My programming is the core of everything. My intellect and countless sleepless nights created it. You were only the handsome frontman, Brian, and now I am tearing that facade away. Emma, wait, Brian begged, reaching for her hand. What about our baby? If you destroy me, you destroy his future. That child is mine, is he not? You know deep down that he needs a father. Emma looked down at his hand on her arm, then her eyes locked with his. She did not try to pull away. A smile touched her lips, but it was hollow and frigid. You honestly want to talk about the baby, Brian? Yes, he said, breathless, thinking he had found a way to reach her. It is my right to know. Fine, she announced, her voice loud enough for nearby guests to turn their attention to them. "The night you kicked me out, I was carrying a small present. Do you remember that?" Brian's brow creased as he tried to recall the moment. He did remember. She was holding a small white box. He had knocked it out of her hand, frantic to get her out of the house before Chloe showed up. "I remember," he whispered. "That box," Emma went on, her voice trembling with restrained fury, "held a positive pregnancy test and a tiny pair of infant shoes. I was trying to share the news with you. I wanted to tell you we were going to have a family, but you just looked at me and told me to get my trash and go." The room seemed to spin as all the color left Brian's face. "So do not stand here pretending you care about fatherhood," Emma raged. "You rejected your own child before you even knew about him. But he has a father now, a real man who held me while I cried, who attended every single doctor visit, and who built the nursery with his own hands." "That is not the same," Brian argued. But his voice was weak. "Biology matters. Biology only makes you a donor, Brian. It is love that makes a father." Suddenly, a strong hand landed on Brian's shoulder. It was Adrian Vance, who had crossed the room with surprising quickness. "Is everything all right here?" Adrian asked, his voice low but filled with a chilling authority. "We are just talking," Brian said, trying to shrug off the hand. It did not move. Adrian's grip was like iron. "It looked to me like you were upsetting my wife," Adrian said. "She is not your wife yet," Brian snapped, his jealousy flaring. Adrian just smiled. He took a folded paper from his jacket and tucked it neatly into Brian's breast pocket. "Read this when you are outside. It is a copy of the adoption papers. I became the child's legal father 2 weeks ago, while he was still in the womb, with Emma's complete agreement. The court finalized it, noting clear abandonment by the biological donor. Brian could only gape at him, completely speechless. "You cannot do that. I am Adrian Vance," he said simply. "There is nothing I cannot do. Now get away from me before I have security escort you down the front stairs." Humiliated and totally broken, Brian ran, feeling the eyes of New York's elite on his back. He stumbled out into the cool night air by Central Park. He took the paper Adrian had given him from his pocket. It was not just an adoption paper. A DNA report was stapled to the back. Subject: Brian Thorne, finding 0% probability of paternity. Brian stood frozen. He read the words again. 0%. His eyes scanned the document, and that is when he saw the physician's note at the bottom. "The subject has a congenital condition rendering him sterile. This condition has most likely been present since adolescence." The paper slipped from his grasp and drifted to the sidewalk. He was not the father. He never could have been the father. It was impossible for him to father a child. But if he was sterile and Emma was pregnant, then who was the real father? All at once, truism, the truth hit him. The timing, the business trip Emma took alone a year ago to the West Coast, the home of Vance Global's main office. She had not met Adrian just 6 months ago. They had a past. The New York City rain does not wash away sins. It just makes the grime slicker. Brian found himself on the street outside a high-end fertility clinic on the Upper East Side. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a sound that seemed to echo inside him. He had burst into the office, demanding answers. He threatened to sue for medical malpractice and yelled that Adrian's DNA test was fraudulent. The doctor, an older man with no patience for the tantrums of the rich, was unmoved. He had simply located Brian's medical chart from 20 years ago. It was a record from Brian's teenage years, when he was hospitalized for severe issues related to his health condition. "I told your parents back then, Mr. Thorne," the doctor said, adjusting his glasses on his nose. The internal trauma was irreversible. You have never been able to have children. We proceeded with the understanding that you knew. Brian walked aimlessly through this rainstorm, his expensive Italian loafers sinking into puddles. He had not known. Or maybe, on some level, he had decided not to face the reality. For 5 years, he had let Emma take the blame. Every month she did not conceive, he would let out a dramatic sigh. He would look at her with disappointment and make a comment about her time running out. He made her believe she was the one with the issue. He pressured her into seeing specialists, made her take medications that made her sick, and shamed her when nothing happened. The entire time, he was the one who was infertile. His hands shook as he hailed a cab. He needed to go home. He needed to tell Chloe. Chloe. The name was a shock. Chloe was with him for a single reason. He had promised her the world. He had promised her an empire for her children to inherit. If she found out he was unable to have children and his company was on the verge of collapse, she would be gone by morning. He entered his penthouse, soaked from the storm. The place was a disaster. Designer bags from shops like Chanel, Hermes, and Prada were tossed everywhere. Chloe was on the couch, surrounded by empty boxes, shouting into her phone, "I don't care if the card was declined, run it again. Do you know who I am with?" She looked over as Brian stood there, a puddle forming on the marble floor. "There you are, Brian. You have to handle my credit card. This is so embarrassing." Brian looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She was beautiful, but it was a cold, manufactured kind of beauty. Her eyes showed no love, only greed. "Chloe," he said softly, "it is time for you to start packing." She let out a high, sharp laugh. "I am sorry. Did you say we were off to Paris?" "No," Brian replied, then walked over and kicked a Chanel box across the room. "You are leaving this apartment. Get out now." Chloe stood up, her face twisting into a nasty sneer. "You must be joking. Do you think you can toss me aside like you did your ex-wife? My ex-wife?" Brian managed to say, the words catching in his throat, "was worth 10 of you. She helped build me. You only ever take from me. Go, Chloe. I am done funding your life." "Fine," she shrieked, knocking a pile of jewelry from a table. "You are no fun at all. And for your information, Brian, everyone laughs at you. You act like some kind of king, but you are just a walking ATM. I also heard about your legal problems. You are about to be a broke man, Brian, and being poor is not a style you can pull off." She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Brian stood alone. He poured himself a stiff drink and looked out at the glittering city lights. He had destroyed his marriage for a woman who cared nothing for him. He had alienated the only person who ever truly believed in him. But then, his sorrow started to shift into something else. A cold, bitter anger began to grow inside him. Emma knew. She had to have known. If she was pregnant and the child was not his because he could not have one, it meant only one thing. She had cheated. The dates just would not add up. They had been divorced for 6 months, but she was 7 months along. She was with another man when they were still a couple. Brian let out a grim, wild laugh. The perfect Saint Emma. The woman who seemed so pure was unfaithful. He grabbed his phone. He called a number he had not used in years, a shady reporter for a tabloid named Barry, who owed him a favor. "Barry," Brian said, his voice smooth and dangerous, "I have a massive story for you. It is the truth about the affair between Adrian Vance and Emma Cross. I will explain how a billionaire stole another man's wife and how Saint Emma was carrying another man's baby while still in her husband's bed." "That is dynamite, Brian," Barry answered, his excitement clear. "But can you prove the timeline?" "The baby is all the evidence you will need," Brian lied. "Run the story. Ruin her name. If she tries to take my company, I will make sure she is too ashamed to show her face." To step inside a courtroom. Brian hung up the phone. He felt a dark, self-pleasing sense of control. If he was going down, he would take them all with him. The headline the next day was vicious. Billionaire baby scandal. Did Adrian Vance take his pregnant mistress from her heartbroken husband? The article presented Brian as the victim. It told the story of a devoted husband who was betrayed by an unfaithful wife, one who had lured a richer man to improve her own social standing. It strongly suggested the child was conceived during a secret affair right under Brian's nose. Brian sat in his office, watching the social media firestorm. Public opinion was shifting his way. People were calling Emma a gold digger. They were questioning Adrian's integrity. This will bring a settlement, Brian told Marcus Sterling, whose face was white with fear. They will drop the case just to make the bad press stop. Brian, Sterling said, his gaze locked on his tablet. You need to see this. Vance Global just called for a press conference. They are streaming it live. Brian turned his chair toward the huge screen on his office wall. Adrian Vance stood at a podium. He did not look worried. He did not look upset in the slightest. He looked like someone about to deliver a verdict. Emma was standing right next to him. She was not trying to hide. She looked straight into the camera with an expression of complete resolve. Earlier today, Adrian began, his strong voice filling the space, a very desperate man tried to use the media to intimidate a pregnant woman. That man's name is Brian Thorne. He accused me of being unfaithful. He said that I broke up a happy marriage. Adrian paused and looked directly at the camera. We saw this coming because people who lie always assume that everyone else is a liar too. Adrian stepped back and Emma walked to the microphone. I was never unfaithful to Brian Thorne, she stated, her voice steady. For 7 years, I was a loyal wife. I stood by him when we had absolutely nothing. I was the person who wrote the code that made him a billionaire while he was asleep. She held up a document. This is a medical report. It is from the Mayo Clinic, from 8 months ago, which was 1 month before Brian filed for divorce. It shows that I underwent a single cycle of IVF therapy with a donor. Brian froze. IVF? I did that, Emma continued, her voice shaking slightly, because my husband was desperate to have a child, but he would not go to see a doctor himself. I planned for it to be a surprise. I wanted to give him the family he always said he wanted. I used my own savings to pay for everything. I went through every single injection, all on my own. A profound quiet fell over the room in the video, and it fell over Brian's office as well. I learned that the procedure was successful on the exact same day Brian had me served with divorce papers, Emma said, as one tear finally escaped and ran down her cheek. I tried to explain. He would not let me speak. He kicked me out of our house. I was pregnant. I had no place to go, and I was completely alone. That is when Adrian Vance came into my life. He did not take me from you, Brian. You cast me aside. He just found the treasure that you were too foolish to appreciate. Adrian stepped back to the microphone. Regarding the company, Mr. Thorne seems to have forgotten a small detail about the ghostwriter software that he stole. Brian's stomach fell to the floor. Emma did not only write the software, Adrian said with a chilling smile. She also built in a protection. There is a fail-safe program buried deep inside the main system, a kill switch. It was made to turn on if the unauthorized user, Brian, attempted to change the core files, which our logs confirm his IT team did just this morning to conceal his theft. Adrian looked at his watch. The kill switch will activate in 3, 2, 1. In Brian's office, the lights started to dim. Then, the quiet hum of the servers all over the building died. Brian's computer screen went totally dark. "Sir," his assistant cried, bursting into his office. "The platform is down. The application is down. Everything has disappeared. The code, it is simply gone. It is wiping itself from every server. Brian slammed his hands on his keyboard in a rage. There was nothing. There was only a dark screen with green text blinking in the corner. Error, user, unauthorized. Goodbye, Brian. On the television, Adrian Vance leaned into the microphone. Thorntech is now just an empty corporation with no assets. Its stock is in total collapse. I have also contacted the SEC to give them proof of Brian Thorne's illegal use of company funds to support his mistress's lavish habits. Adrian's eyes were like chips of ice. Checkmate, Brian. The broadcast was over. Brian sat in the complete quiet of his dead office. His phone began to ring. It was the board members, then the SEC, and then his bank. He ignored them all. He walked to the huge window and looked down at the streets of Manhattan. He had always dreamed of being a king. He had always wanted to be powerful. He finally got what he wanted. He was now powerful, but only as a warning to others. He saw a black SUV stop at the curb many floors below. He saw a small woman in a green coat get into the vehicle, helped by a tall man. Even from so far away, he could recognize the gentleness in the man's actions. Emma. She had won. She had not only defeated him, she had completely wiped him from existence. Brian sank to the floor. The silence of the empty office was a crushing weight. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the old, Baz folded picture he had kept in his wallet for so many years. It was a photo of him and Emma in their college dorm room, sharing pizza on the floor, smiling. They were poor, but he had looked so happy. He knew in that instant, beneath the immense pressure of his total failure, that was the most prosperous he had ever been. And he had thrown it all away for a fancy light fixture that was never really his to begin with. In the fast-paced world of big business, 3 years is an eternity. In 3 years, new corporations emerge, powerful empires crumble, and names that once made headlines are forgotten. But for Brian Thorne, 3 years was like 300. The end had not been quick. It was not the fast, neat conclusion he might have preferred when his office went black. It was the slow, painful dismantling of his entire world. The SEC investigation took 18 months, a public shaming that took away every last piece of his self-respect. They seized the penthouse first, followed by the cars, and then the art. He recalled the day the marshals came to take his watch collection. He simply stood there and watched. Imagine losing everything in a single moment. For Brian, that moment came when a cop in a cheap windbreaker took his Patek Philippe watch, the one he bought with his first $10 million, and dropped it into an evidence bag like a cheap toy. That's when his wife Chloe left him. She didn't pack. She just called a car, gave him a dead-eyed stare and said, "You're bad for my brand." Now, 3 years later, Brian was just a man named Jules, shivering on a Chicago sidewalk. The brutal lake wind cut through his thin valet uniform. He wasn't a tech mogul anymore. He was the guy who parked the cars. "Hey, Jules, wake up," a voice snapped. It was Manny, his 20-year-old boss. Manny was a kid who knew more about vaping and TikTok than the man standing next to him. To him, Brian was just some old guy, slow on the draw and clumsy with the keys. "I'm awake," Brian mumbled, trying to stomp life back into his frozen feet. His worn-out shoes had given up hours ago, letting icy slush soak his socks. "Big night," Manny said, exhaling a cloud of strawberry smoke into Brian's face. "The future of tech gala. VIPs everywhere. Don't scratch a thing, old-timer. These cars are worth more than you'll ever be." Brian winced at the irony. 5 years ago, he was the main speaker at this exact event, talking about vision and innovation under the hot, blinding spotlights. He remembered seeing Emma, in the front row that night, her hands clasped in her lap, looking at him with a pride he now knew was completely unearned. He had made her wear a simple blue dress, calling the designer one she picked too flashy. Tonight he wasn't on stage. He was part of the service staff. The hotel doors swung open, spilling warm light and jazz music onto the cold pavement. The scent of rich perfume and roasted food drifted out, a cruel jab at the deep hunger in his stomach. He had skipped lunch to save $5 for his heating bill. Guests began to emerge. He saw his old lawyer, Marcus Sterling, who glanced right through him before handing over a ticket for a Mercedes. Brian kept his head down and took the stub. With the brim of his cap pulled low, he retrieved the car and accepted a $2 tip in silence, watching his old life drive away. Being a ghost in a world you once ruled was its own special kind of torture. "Heads up," Manny hissed, snapping to attention. "We got a big fish. Private driver, blacked out Escalade. It's the Vance party." Vance? The name shocked Brian like a cattle prod. His throat tightened. He wanted to vanish, to fake an illness, to run into the night, anything but this. But his feet were cemented to the spot, paralyzed by a mixture of sheer terror and morbid curiosity. The enormous SUV pulled to a stop, flanked by 2 security cars. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a rolling command center. The powerful hum of its engine vibrated through the soles of Brian's feet. "Jules, get the door," Manny ordered, distracted by a woman in a fur coat. Brian moved forward, his hands shaking so violently he had to hide them behind his back to calm them. As he reached for the passenger door, he caught his reflection in the tinted window, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with gray stubble who looked 20 years older than his actual 35. He pulled the heavy handle. The door opened, releasing a wave of warm air that smelled of rich leather and jasmine. The first thing he saw was a handmade Italian leather shoe. Adrian Vance emerged. Time had been a friend to Adrian, carving him into an even more formidable presence. He was broader than Brian remembered, his salt and pepper hair cut in a severe, clean style. He moved with the confidence of someone who commanded every room he entered. He didn't even glance at the valet. Instead, he turned back to the car and offered a hand. "Careful, love. It's icy." A hand slipped into his. It was a hand Brian knew intimately. He knew its shape, its touch from when she would soothe his headaches or scrub dishes in their first cramped apartment. Then Emma stepped out, and the air left Brian's body. She was breathtaking. The timid woman he remembered was gone, replaced by a vision of pure elegance. She wore a stunning crimson velvet gown and a white coat that looked like freshly fallen snow. Glamorous waves framed her face, and elegant diamonds graced her neck, a far cry from the flashy jewels Chloe used to favor. But it wasn't the luxury that stunned him, it was her expression. The worry lines that had etched her face during their years together were gone. In their place was a deep, radiant calm. She looked peaceful, loved. "Wait for me." A small voice called from inside the car. Brian froze. A little boy, no older than 3, scrambled to the edge of the seat. He was bundled in a tiny peacoat and a bright red scarf. His dark, curly hair peeking out, Adrian let out a deep, joyful laugh. "We didn't forget you, Leo," he said. "Come on out, champ." Adrian effortlessly lifted the boy onto his hip. Leo giggled and wrapped his small arms around Adrian's neck. "Daddy, did you see the robot with lasers?" the boy asked, his voice filled with wonder. "I sure did," Adrian replied, kissing his son's head. "But I think you liked the dessert table a little more." "I like cookies," Leo declared seriously. Emma smiled, gently brushing a snowflake off the boy's nose. "You are 100% your father's son, a weakness for sweets and lasers." Your father's son. The word slammed into Brian, echoing in the empty space where his ego once lived. Leo wasn't his. He couldn't be. The DNA test had been the final humiliation. He was sterile, a genetic dead end. All his grand speeches about legacy had been lies. His talk of building a dynasty with the Thorn name was all a fraud. The real legacy was right here, a happy, healthy child raised by a man who earned respect without demanding it. Brian remained frozen by the open car door, a statue in a cheap uniform. He knew he should close it and fade back into the background, but he couldn't look away from the boy. Leo had his mother's smile. Suddenly, the child saw him. Their eyes met. Leo didn't see a failure or a fraud. He just saw a man in a funny hat. "Hi," Leo said, waving a mittened hand. That one simple word shattered the last of Brian's composure. Hot tears filled his eyes. He tried to speak, to say hello, but his throat had sealed shut. Emma turned, following her son's gaze, and her eyes landed on the valet. For a long second, the world stood still. The snow fell silently, muffling the city noise. Then, recognition dawned. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't gasp or cover her mouth. Her eyes just widened slightly as she took in the shabby uniform, the soaked shoes, and the name tag that read Jules. Brian braced himself for the sneer, the cruel laugh, the whispered comment to Adrian to look at the mess her ex-husband had become. A dark part of him almost wanted it. Her anger would mean he still mattered in some way. But Emma wasn't angry. Instead, her face softened with a look of profound, crushing sadness. It was the look you give a wounded animal, one that's been hurt too much to ever trust again. It was pure, detached pity. She didn't say his name or acknowledge their past. She simply turned back to her family. "It's freezing out here, Adrian," she said softly. "Let's get Leo inside before he gets a chill." "Absolutely," he agreed. Adrian turned to Brian, completely oblivious. To him, Brian Thorne was just a footnote from an old chapter of Emma's life. So insignificant, he didn't even register. "Great service." "Sus," Adrian said, his voice polite and businesslike. He reached into his coat, pulled out a bill, and pressed it into Brian's palm. "Stay warm," he added. Brian looked down. It was a crisp, new $100 bill. The face of Benjamin Franklin seemed to mock him. "Thank you, sir," Brian whispered, the sound so broken and hoarse he barely recognized his own voice. Adrian gave a final nod and led his family toward the hotel's warm, golden entrance. A car was waiting to drive them to the airport. "Bye-bye," Leo happily called from Adrian's shoulder, waving his little gloved hand. Brian could only raise a shaky hand for a tiny, weak wave back. "Bye," he mouthed without a sound. He watched them leave. He saw Adrian lean in and whisper something to Emma. Then he watched Emma lay her head on Adrian's shoulder. They moved as one, a perfect circle of love and happiness. They were a family, and Brian was just the man holding the door. As the hotel's heavy glass doors closed, locking them away, the silence of the street returned. The wind howled around the corner of the building. Brian just stared at the $100 bill in his hand. There was a time he would have used a bill like this to light a cigar. He once would have tipped a waitress this much just for bringing him some water. He would have laughed at such a small amount. But now, this single piece of paper was the difference between eating and starving. It was the choice between staying warm and freezing in the bitter cold. He gripped the bill so hard his knuckles turned white. A painful sob began to rise from deep inside him, and he could not stop it. He fell back against the hotel's cold stone, sliding down until he was huddled on the damp pavement. He had spent his entire life building a wall of money to keep people away, thinking it made him strong. He treated people like numbers on a balance sheet. He threw away the only woman who ever truly loved him, and he did it for nothing. He did it all for an image, something that would look good on the cover of a magazine. He wanted to be a king, but now he knew the truth. Kings are just ordinary men in fancy clothes. Real strength is not in a crown. It is in having a hand to hold when life gets cold. Emma had found her hand to hold. Brian just had his own two hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Hey, Jules!" Manny shouted from the valet stand, completely oblivious to the broken man on the sidewalk. "Stop hiding your tips. We got a Corolla pulling up. Let us go!" Brian wiped his face on the rough sleeve of his jacket. He took a long, unsteady breath. The freezing air burned his lungs, snapping him back to reality. "Coming," he rasped out, and slowly pushed himself up. He adjusted his cheap, baggy jacket. He tucked the $100 bill, a pity payment from his ex-wife's new husband, into his pocket beside his bus pass. He walked toward the dented Corolla, arriving at the curb. He opened the door, put on a fake smile, and bowed his head. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza," Brian said softly. "How can I help you?" And that, my friends, is the quiet, cold collapse of Brian Thorne. There was no big bang, no dramatic courtroom scene. It was just the slow, freezing realization that he had built his own prison cell. He spent his life chasing expensive things, but never understood what was truly valuable. He threw away a perfect diamond while he was busy chasing shiny dust, and by the time he realized his error, that diamond was already shining in another man's ring. It is a tough lesson about what goes around comes around. Sometimes, the worst punishment is not something that happens to you, but seeing what you have lost forever. Brian did not get the family, the warmth, or a meaningful life. He just got a handout. I am really curious to hear your thoughts down in the comments. That look of pity Emma gave him, do you think that hurt more than if she had yelled at him? Is giving someone the silent treatment the best revenge? And if you were Emma, would you have said something? Or was walking away without a word the right move? Let us get a conversation going below. If this story gave you the chills, do me a favor and tap that like button. It tells the YouTube algorithm to share these stories with more people. And be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks so much for watching, and never forget to be good to the people you meet on your way to the top. You just might see them again on your way back down. Our team puts a lot of care into researching, writing, and editing these stories to bring you lessons that matter and stories that stay with you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community,